further ado, just a welcome to this morning's During the Cud session. As hopefully you all know, these are really informal sessions. So with Sheila and Isabel's permission, do feel free to interject and put a hand up and ask questions as we go. But I think we'll probably also have plenty of time for questions at the end. I think probably Isabel will be familiar to many of you already, Sheila possibly not, but they're both colleagues of mine here at the Museum of English Rural Life. Isabel is Associate Director of the MERL and Head of Curatorial and Public Engagement. So like me, has an enormously cumbersome title and hopefully not too cumbersome a task in those roles. And Sheila Fisher is our volunteer coordinator, so largely working as part of our Museums Partnership Reading, so a national portfolio organisation working across Reading Museum and the Museum of English Rural Life. But Sheila has also been taking a lead, along with Isabel, on our work on EDI, so that's equity, diversity and inclusion, often referred to in other contexts. I think McKinsey referred to it as DE and I, just to confuse matters. And there's been a recent initiative that Sheila's been leading on for us, the museum's wide activity, which I'm sure she'll be explaining a little bit more about. This is new to many of us, I'm sure, and I think many of you will also be working on it in your own institutions in various different ways. But without further ado, I shall hand over to Sheila and to Isabel to share what we've been doing here at the MERL.
So good morning, everyone. I'm going to be kicking off. We have got a bit of a presentation to share just to frame the conversation, really. But for my own part, I've become increasingly interested in the EDI since 2020 during the lockdowns, and I took the opportunity to attend quite a lot of webinars on the subject, particularly anti-racism, improving my own knowledge of neurodivergence, and just generally dismantling barriers. And so my commitment was to become as good an ally as I can to people who've experienced barriers to joining the profession, and to participation in museums generally. So I'll just share the presentation that we've prepared. So I'll be doing the beginning and end bit, and Isabel will be talking to the middle parts. And so hopefully you can see that. Yeah, is that all right, Ollie? You can see that. As Ollie mentioned, I was then able to take part in the first cohort of the museum-wide programme, which is the South East Museum Development, and that was from November 2021 to May 2022, and that WIDE stands for Welcoming, Inclusive, Diverse and Equitable. And we had to commit to at least 35 hours of CPD. And so some of the headlines of what were covered included webinars about website accessibility, diversifying volunteering, which of course has been a key focus of mine in the past 5 years, revisiting collections with a view to decolonisation. And we also had a good framework of cohort coffee catch-ups and also one-to-ones with the lead EDI consultant, Isilda Almeida. And a key focus underpinning that was to become brave and bold was the title that we worked to. So in other words, working as internal champions, advocating for EDI to ensure our museums are committed to involving and representing as many people and many members of our diverse community as possible, to be as relevant as possible. I mean, essentially, it isn't necessarily a role that anyone in an organisation is responsible for, and this programme recognised that really we all can be a leader on the subject. So I have had experience of senior leadership in the past, which was useful, but it wasn't necessary. You didn't have to, and so many members of the programme were not necessarily in the upper echelons of their organisation, but were champions and keen to connect other colleagues that were able to drive this program forward. And we started with within the museum with a self-assessment in February 2022, and we wanted to look at what we felt we were all doing well, because we weren't starting from a baseline where we have never considered EDI. And so we felt that what we were doing well at on that day was our commitment to EDI on that day. I mean, 10 colleagues attended that. That's a good proportion of the regular people that work in the museum at the MERL. Our community engagement work, led by our learning and engagement manager, is considered to be quite spearheading, and is introducing new audiences to our museum, and has been for many years. We also had a relabeling and research project called Building Connections, which was actually started during lockdown and involved as many people as we could, remotely researching. The volunteering programme, I'm pleased to say, is increasingly reflective of the local community, in which approximately 1 in 3 people are from a diverse ethnic community. And we are almost reflecting that in our statistics now, where people volunteer that information. We consider we're a safe space, so we're friendly and non-judgmental environment, and also online. We work hard with our programming and exhibitions to try to ensure that we're not just always doing the same thing, we can attract new audiences. And we also include an archives and special collections team within our organisation, and they're spearheading some work in the harmful content working group, so where historically the archives might have problematic language. We're trying to work on being open about what's to come if you were to hit on that when you're researching. We're finding that peer organisations are looking to us for best practice. Thank you for today. And also not standing still, we're taking risks. So this was our baseline. So we felt pleased that we were starting from a baseline where we've been working on things, but we wanted to take things a bit more formally and also be really honest about where there are some challenges. So at that time, we identified some priorities for the future, including workforce recruitment, changes that we could make within the limitations of the structural challenges of being part of a university. Because of course, we consider ourselves from day to day a museum that is quite self-sufficient, but we obviously do sit under a large organisation. We would like to, over the coming years, more formally reviewing our collection policies and documentation, and more formally understanding our audiences better. One internal change that we have instigated already is putting EDI on the agenda of all standing meetings, standing committees, so that it is discussed regularly. In terms of accessible environments, we are a relatively new museum, and we were reopened it's about 7 years ago as well, isn't it now, that we reopened in the current format that we are. And we didn't want to be complacent that because we're relatively newly redeveloped that we are definitely accessible in all senses of the word. So we attempted to carry out our own audit based on an audit document that our partner museum had established. However, we did find it, Isabel and I think wouldn't be afraid to say that it was overwhelming. It was very, very many pages long. And whilst we were able to take quick wins like the visitor services team completing disability awareness training, making sure that we're as up to date as we are about our knowledge about how things are, we felt that it was going to be time to commission an external audit. So I'll come to that in just a minute. But I also wanted to just let you know that we do have a web resource of Street View, which if you click, I can send the presentation later, but you can see that we're actually on Street View and you can go through our galleries. So at a certain point in time, a few years ago, visitors can visit our museum before they come. So that is quite a useful resource. I don't know if you've seen this cartoon before, but I find it quite arresting, the difference between equality and equity. And I wanted to just include it in case people hadn't seen it. Unfortunately, I don't have the resource where it's come from, I'm afraid, but it's well used on the internet, and it's showing the difference between if you do the same for everybody, if you give everyone the same, then that's equality. Equity is about being more equitable for certain people. So it might be, for example, people with protected characteristics. You and your museum might need to work harder to give everyone the same experience. So I think that shows that in quite a good visual way to be able to enjoy the experience.
Shall I take over at this point, or?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So as Sheila said, we had, oh, not that one, this one. We started to think about auditing, and it was around about the time we reopened after lockdown. And I don't know about the rest of you, but coming back into the museum after a period of closure, you start to see the museum again through fresh eyes. And some of the things that perhaps you've put up with and thought, oh, well, you know, that's the way it is, and you walk straight past it. It was much more glaringly obvious when you came in after a few months of being closed. And the museum that we compared ourselves with, or we used their auditing documents, is a 19th century building with a lot of stairs and a lot of levels. And so their auditing document was very much about that. We, if you know the museum, the gallery was built in about 2000. So after sort of key disability legislation, so architects were aware about level entry and so on, but it's other sorts of things that are often the issue for us. And as Sheila says, we started off thinking, oh, we need to change this, we need to change this. And gradually, or not even gradually, quickly produced a sort of exhaustive list, and we hadn't even moved out of the second gallery. And so we felt we were a bit overwhelmed. And also, embarrassingly, I'm going to be honest here, that MERL had never done an external audit, as far as I'm aware. And I think it's because we'd sort of got away with it because we were in a brand new building, that the assumption was that our access was well thought through, which in many ways it was, but we hadn't had an external view on it. So we managed to get together, and we've put the figure there of how much it cost us to have the Centre for Accessible Environments come and do an external audit. And because we want to use this for accreditation, we encouraged our other collections to get involved in this. So we managed for one day to get ourselves done, plus the art collection that's in the same building as us that's going for accreditation, plus the Greek archaeology museum that we have on the other campus. So there are ways that you can get a better deal if you need to. And they produced an extensive report, but they also suggested training. And there were two ways of having the training. We went for the access awareness training for people generally, but there is a model where you can be trained to audit for yourself. But I think we felt, having tried it ourselves, we wanted an external view and then us to have as much awareness as possible. So as you can see, we've got two co-leads to progress actions. And because I head up both the team that Ollie is in and the team that Sheila is in, it seemed appropriate to have that budgetary oversight. So I became one of the co-leads. And then, as you'll see when we start to show you bits of the audit, what we've been having to do is constantly think about priorities, because you will end up with so many things that you think you could improve, and it's how to make your decisions and be honest about what you can do and how to pace yourself. And then finally, for us particularly, because we're part of a university, we have an estates department that manages the sort of bricks and mortar side of things. And in some ways that's positive because it's not our bill, but it does mean that we're not in control of whether and when things will happen. And we've actually been very lucky to have a new person running the estates department, and she is very keen on access, which I have to say has not necessarily been the way in the past. So positively showing her that we've had a report done and meeting with her regularly to talk about some of the things that are not working in the building and how we can fix that. So should we have the next slide? We just thought, I think we're not allowed to show you the entire report that the centre did to do with their sort of copyright, but we'll just give you a snapshot of the sort of thing they do. That they're, it's very much a physical audit. They do look at how people physically get around the building, and they do look at things like the size and presentation of the labels and the interpretation, but they wouldn't, for instance, look at things like neurodivergence and other means of sort of assessing how accessible you are. But for us, I mean, it's a lot of things to think about. I mean, for instance, the top of this presentation, you can see we've got some handy question, you know, lift me flaps, what is this object? And here it is. And the text is far too small. So we've tried to be accessible and welcoming, but actually we haven't quite got it right in terms of the size of text. We don't have huge amounts of seating in the museum, and it's a very common thing for people who don't know the museum to come in and say, oh, I didn't realize it was this big. And pacing yourself, we've got stools that you can carry around and sit with, but there was a view that we should have much more seating around the place. And this one here is about this is a view down what we call the wagon walk, where you've got a collection of wagons on one side and the walls on the other where we have interpretation. And they were saying that for someone with a visual impairment, it's quite difficult to pace yourself and to judge the distances, because I mean, that's a particularly nasty photograph of what we have. It makes it look like a sort of horrible pathway that narrow pathway you're going down, but it's still the case that it's difficult to pace yourself and spot the columns. So we have a huge number of these actions to think about, and we meet regularly to look at the audit and to think where we can make changes. So shall I move on? So I just want to mention one or two things that we've done as well. And Curating for Change is a programme that you may have heard about in other contexts, but it's funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and it's run by Accentuate, who are part of Screen South. And we were lucky enough to be part of the programme, which was about hosting placements and fellows to be, or rather trainees and fellows who were from the deaf and disabled community. And the point of it was to go through the entire process of how to recruit, how to take people on board, how to work with people, and how to evaluate the process at the end. And we were taking on a trainee, so we took on someone called Verity Sheila Fisher for 6-8 weeks. Other fellows are staying much longer in other museums, but we learned a huge amount from the programme about the way that we recruit. I mean, we've always known as the university that we don't have a very accessible way of recruiting. If you must apply online, and you must fill in a very particular form. You can't. There's no leeway on that. And with this programme, because it was essentially a bursary, so it wasn't the university doing the employing, we were allowed to follow their recruitment procedures. And so they allowed for applying in writing or applying by making a film, and the different alternative formats that you could fill in a form, or you could write a piece of narrative about yourself. A very interesting one that we think is a real winner is giving the interview questions in advance, so that it doesn't become a sort of trial of, can I remember what the interviewer asked me? You've actually got time to prepare the questions and give of your best. And we found that the university HR department are actually quite interested in this as a way forward. and then what they called access riders, which are the same as the riders that rock stars get when they go and do concerts. What are the things that you must have in order for you to be here? And so you went through an extensive discussion with the candidate about where they would work, how they would get to work, what they would need. Are there any extra things that we can provide to support them? So that's been a very valuable project. It's still going on, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of learning from it that they'll produce and share with the museum's community. So this is back to Sheila. Yeah.
Thanks, Isabel. And obviously, you know, I look after the volunteering programme. So one of my recommendations would be, don't forget that volunteers, particularly those who've been sort of out of the workforce for some years, may not be keeping up to date with inclusive practice, because, you know, it might be that as the general staff workforce, you might be offered things like unconscious bias training. This isn't something that's generally been offered. So we commissioned bespoke inclusivity training entitled Being a Welcoming and Inclusive Museum with Isilda Almeida, who you remember was the museum-wide EDI consultant. So that's quite recently in March, and I was able to tailor it. I was able to say, these are some of the things, because the challenge I was finding was, having had, you know, probably at least 50 hours of CPT, was I can't then sit down all my colleagues for 50 hours and go through everything that I've learned. But I was able to sort of pick out some of the highlights that I remembered from the training, and, you know, I said, this, perhaps we could tailor something around this. And so it covered some of the key learnings. And our volunteers, we had 20 of our visitor facing volunteers, very good proportion of the regulars. And we also were able to include the 4 permanent visitor services team and obviously volunteer HQ. And the volunteers gave us great feedback about how thought-provoking it was. It wasn't a difficult, I mean, it wasn't always a, there were difficult subjects that we had to give a trigger warning about one of the pieces that would be, because it's quite hard hitting, but I think it really did help to share the idea of lived experience for those who've faced societal barriers. So Isabel and I thought we'd include a section on challenges in moving forward your EDI action plan. Obviously we already have EDI policies and HR procedures as part of the university, but I feel that we collectively have been brave and bold, referring back to that phrase from museum wide, in seeking to be more flexible than the existing situation permitted. And it's great to hear Isabel saying just now that the university have started taking notice about what we're doing and in that curating for change learnings. It will feel that there is never enough time to do it properly, but my advice is dare to start, because I think what might be the issue is that you think, I don't want to get something wrong. I'm afraid to start, and you know, I really wanted to say today, Isabel and I are not trying to say that we are the complete experts in all matters EDI, but I think what we have been is bold enough to move it forward and be honest that it's going to be a journey. So we say that our EDI action plan is a live document that is continually reviewed and updated. Unfortunately, it may be limited by the cost of changes and not be completely in control of the building that you operate in. And also the general challenge of current financial constraints. Much of the above that we've talked about has been funded by project funding. And obviously, ideally, you'd set aside an EDI budget. But we wondered whether you might need to consider bidding separately for EDI-led initiatives. So this is a snapshot, a screenshot of our EDI action plans. You can see this was the template that was provided for us for the museum-wide training, and it encouraged you to set smart objectives and be clear about who's leading on them. And then we've been updating regularly. So Isabel and I are trying to meet monthly to review the EDI so that we make sure that we're progressing matters. And so for us, EDI, we realised that the strategy can't sit in isolation from our ongoing museum engagement activity and programming, which is doing great work. The EDI strategy clearly refers to projects planned for the next MPO activity plan, which is strongly underpinned by diversification of all audiences in very targeted ways. And we reviewed our access policy statement for the next 5 years. We plan to develop a new audience development plan. And we've had our first internal wide action group. So that's our working group for interested members of the MERL, and that's going to meet quarterly. We also want to reconvene our access committee that started to try to do that audit, and then we can support the delivery of the findings from the external audit. And we have successfully brought EDI onto the standing agendas of all significant internal meetings. And also we're seeking to align our EDI action plan with our MPO partner museums, so that it shows that we're working in partnership. I remember Ollie said from the word go that we need to consider global representation and equity in addition to local community, because I will admit I've been quite focused on local community and making sure we're representative for local community, but there's also the much wider implications of what our collections discuss, interpret, represent. So that's something that we need to build into the future. And also just be patient, keep at it. You know, as I say, we have our diarised monthly progress meetings. So if you're looking for tips of like where to start, you may find the Southwest Museums Development EDI Roadmap Toolkit useful. So on the presentation, that's a clickable link through to this, but it shows how, starting with evaluation, you may choose to prioritise accessibility, bringing people with you, such as your trustees, developing your statement, remodelling volunteer recruitment, and through to working up your policies, broadening your trustee representation, and finally, the end of the road, the goal being that EDI impact is across all activities. So some quick win suggestions are unconscious bias training is a very good place to start. Read up and watch videos about a range of lived experience. You know, one thing that is a big headline that keeps coming up is I don't like to be asked to speak for all my community. There are lots of resources out there already about lived experience, and you may have heard about the term about emotional load. If you keep asking members of an underrepresented community to come in and tell you what is that, it's like, no, there's a lot out there, so please be responsible and read up as much as you can. I've got a list of resources about inclusive language that I can share, and also I'd recommend there's a link here to a white privilege test. Our training used a sample of about 10 of the 26 questions that have been established in quite a famous white privilege test, in which it challenges one's assumptions about how much advantage one has if one comes from the white community, you know, on the day-to-day basis. I also recommend improving your imagery to ensure that a broader range of people are represented. So I've been changing volunteer role descriptions and web pages for many years now, and to ensure that people feel represented, a wide range of people are represented, and so more people feel welcome. And also just starting small to build up your own confidence, perhaps focus on one target audience at a time.